Perfect.
Okay, our first topic in series of presenters is going to talk about feedlot marketing, and really been a lot of discussion and issues about that over the last year, and certainly will continue. So I think it's great. We've got Steve Sunderman, and he's obviously in the midst of production and based out of Norfolk here in Northeast Nebraska. And Steve's also involved with Nebraska Cattlemen and the marketing committee there, and also has served in the national leadership roles in the marketing committees of the NCBA, really trying to get a handle on what should the industry be doing in response to establishing, I guess, fair market prices and how to learn that and figure that out. So Steve's going to do a nice job, I think, of taking us through what the issues are, and sure appreciate you doing this, Steve, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Gail. No, I appreciate you guys inviting me to be a part of this and present on these issues. I'll go ahead and I've got our presentation here. I'll pull up. See if you guys can see that.
Yep.
Perfect. So as Galen mentioned, my family, we've got a farm and cattle feedlot just south of Norfolk that I manage with my parents.
Steve,
And
one thing
then,
you want to do is click
yeah.
on the top on the display settings because it's showing the other one.
Oh, let me do that real quick.
There you go.
How's that?
Yep. Perfect.
So my parents and I manage a farm and feedlot here south of Norfolk, but I also have gotten pretty involved with some of the cattlemen associations. So back in 2014, I came on as vice chair of Nebraska Cattlemen's Marketing Commerce Committee. I've been chair for the last 3 years, and this is actually my last year as chair. I actually just got done being chair of National Cattlemen's Live Cattle Marketing Committee the last 2 years. And so through that process, I've delved fully into these price discovery and fed cattle marketing issues that we've been trying to address here the last couple of years. It's been the last 20 years that we've seen things trend. And so I just want to give you guys a background on, what are some of the causes of this? What are we seeing? And then what are some of the policy implications that are being discussed to try and help solve this issue? So the first thing that I want to start off with going through is, how do we define and categorize the ways we trade fat cattle? So the USDA does mandatory price reporting. It's now called LMR, but the 4 ways that they go ahead and they define trade is either it's negotiated cash, which is probably what most folks are familiar with. If I am trading cattle with Cargill today and I decide to either trade them live at $1.12 or I decide to trade them dressed at $1.80, as long as those prices are set the day I sell them, they go in and are called negotiated cash. Somewhat similar to negotiated cash is negotiated grid. So negotiated grid would be setting the base price. So again, setting $1.80 with Cargill. But when I deliver those cattle, there are going to be discounts and premiums that are added or subtracted based on the carcass merits. So the America Angus grid from Cargill is probably the most well-known negotiated grid out there. But JBS also offers some. Tyson National, not so much, but that's something we can get into later on in the presentation. The next form that often is heard about, but is a little bit more harder to define, is formula. The most basic way to understand what a formula trade is it's any trade to a packer where you commit the cattle, but you do not set the price the day that you sell them. Often those formulas are set off of some USDA weighted average. That's the majority of how them are set. And so, for instance, if I trade cattle to Tyson or JBS or Cargill today, I say, hey, I'm going to sell you this pen of 200 head. We're going to do the Nebraska weighted average plus 50 cents. And so on Monday morning, when the USDA comes out with the report what the Nebraska average was for the week prior, I'm going to get that price plus 50 cents as my price on those cattle. The last category is forward contract. So that'd be any trade that you set, say, basis ahead of time. It actually is it could even seem like it's a negotiated cash trade. It's if you set the price and the delivery is more than 30 days out, it gets defined as a forward contract. So say I sell my cattle today at $1.80 dressed, but they're not going to ship for 6 weeks. those cattle would actually fall into the forward contract bucket. So to give you guys an idea of where we are and where we've been, this chart isn't fully updated. It's through fall of last year, but it gives you a sense of what the trend has been within the industry of how we trade fat cattle. If you look at the green line, that actually is formula trades. So if you look back, 2008, 2009, 10 years ago, we were around that 30, 35% range. Today we're, essentially at 70%. As that formula's gone up, we've seen, inversely, negotiated trade has gone down. And that would be that purple line there. On the very bottom, there's also a blue line, which is our negotiated grid, which is light blue, and then the darker blue is packer ownership, with red as the forward contract. Now, there is something that's interesting on this chart. You'll see that last spring, there was a blip where the negotiated grid increased dramatically, and at the same time, the formula dropped dramatically. What that's actually showing is National Beef on their U.S. premium beef formula grids. When the market volatility was at an extreme, they went ahead and they just told everybody that was on that grid, hey, we know that things are really volatile right now. We're just going to go ahead and set your price this week and next week on the base instead of going off the weighted average. And so what you saw is that huge volume then switched from being considered a formula to a negotiated grid. Now, there were some at the time that thought, oh, well, this is great. Let's hope this continues. But they went ahead and they went back to the weighted average after a few weeks of doing that. Now, you may ask, why are we seeing that trend? Why are we seeing more and more people go to selling formula versus selling negotiated cash? And the easiest way to explain it is that there's a financial incentive to be selling your cattle on a formula. So what this table here is showing you is you can take the negotiated cash trade on any given week, subtract it from what the formula net trade price is that we get reported, and see what that premium is to be traded on a formula trade versus trading negotiated cash. And so you'll see here there's obviously consistently been a premium, but it actually ranges a lot by region as well. You'll see that, like for instance, in 2020, when this information was last updated, Texas at 450 premium, Kansas at 570, 100 weight over what negotiated cash was. Colorado was $7 over. You may ask, why are they getting a premium for these cattle? Part of it is because, a lot of times they're doing a grid that they're delivering cattle that are meeting what the need is for that particular packer and what beef sales he has. They're also giving committed supply to packers, so they can go ahead and make beef orders and plan on receiving those cattle. At the same time, there's some positives for the feeder too. He can schedule his cattle and out more in advance and know when to bring new cattle in. But as we kind of go through these policy implications, one thing I want to really highlight is, until we can figure out how to make it more financially advantageous to trade cash versus formula, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to voluntarily fix this issue. Now, you may ask, we are seeing this trend. We're seeing less and less cash trade, more and more formula trade. Why is this a problem? Like, we're still getting cattle sold and we're still getting them slaughtered. What we find is, and this is a study done by Dr. Coons from Colorado State, and Dr. Dennis is going to go on this a little bit later, but discussing how he kind of got to these numbers through his study and what methodology he used. But what he did is he did a study to see what amount of cattle do we need to trade in each one of these regions to get what we define as robust price discovery. What we realize is that if you trade too few cattle, you may have a market, you may have a price, but that price may not truly reflect what that animal is or what that product may be. This is an issue that they've had a lot of troubles with in the hog industry, for instance. If you look at hogs, less than 1% of all hogs slaughtered nationally are traded in the negotiated market. And so they've had to turn to using futures. They've had to turn to using the pork cutout. They've had to go to other markets to try and figure out what these hogs are worth. And that's something that the cattle industry is trying to avoid and trying to, increase the negotiated trade we have so that this price discovery situation can be resolved. And so you can see here, so for instance, in the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, we need approximately 13,000 head a week traded to get robust price discovery. In Kansas, 21,000, Colorado 5, Nebraska 31,000, and Iowa and southern Minnesota 16. One question I'm asked a lot is, well, why is the number so much smaller for Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and so much larger, say, for instance, for Nebraska, even though that we are, slaughtering approximately the same number of head every week? Dr. Dennis will get a little bit of that in the methodology, but one thing I've realized too is that, um, Nebraska may be selling or slaughtering the same number of head every week as Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, but we have multi-tier markets. And what I mean by that is in Texas, you're only selling cattle in the live market. But if you go to Nebraska, there's the live market, there's the dress market, there's a dress market picked up or delivered, live, picked up or delivered. And so I think that also helps contribute to the fact you need more cattle to get robust price discovery throughout. So talking about some of the policy implications around trying to increase negotiated trade and meet these robust price discovery numbers. Some of these you guys are probably familiar with. They've been very much talked about on Capitol Hill in the last year or two, and they're going to be a hot topic again this year. And so the one that's probably the most prevalent you hear about is legislative flat mandates. And so these are bills that are asking for just a flat mandate in terms of how many cattle are traded on any given week. And so the one that Senator Grassley introduced last year asked for a 50% negotiated trade of all the cattle on a weekly basis that slaughter within 14 days. There was talk about a 30% of negotiated trade that's mandated to the packers. Senator Fisher actually just introduced a bill yesterday. Hers asked for a minimum level negotiated trade per region. So essentially used those Dr. Kuntz numbers and said those are the minimum mandated minimum levels that need to be traded in the negotiated market each week by the packer. And so, that is one way that you could go about trying to increase negotiated trade and maintain those robust price discovery levels. Personally, my issue with that is that you're making someone bear the cost of trading these cattle and negotiating them. And so another option that has been talked about is trying to use more market-based programs. So ways to actually incentivize financially people to negotiate cattle versus just committing them on, say, a formula. Those two would be a negotiate grid, which I talked about a little bit before, which is a category, but essentially you set the base price on those cattle, and then you get rewarded on the carcass merits of those cattle. Jordan Levy from Five Rivers and Arcadia Asset Management, he's been a big proponent of this, and he actually put together a kind of grid for all packers to utilize, and I'll go into a little more depth on that in the presentation. The other market-based program is called Market Maker Program, and so essentially what that program is asking is it says, well, as a formula trader, you're using this weighted average from the USDA, but you're not actually paying for it. You're not contributing in terms of time or the cost of setting the price, where those on the negotiated cash side are taking the time, they're giving up money by not going to formula by doing this, but yet they're not getting paid for it. So if we had all the cattle that trade formula put in so many dollars per head, similar to the checkoff, and have those dollars separated up and split to be paid to the negotiated traders, then there'd be an actual financial incentive for them to continue to negotiate and contribute to the negotiated market. The last kind of option that I'll discuss is regulatory measures. So this would be trying to use LMR, the MPR data that we receive from USDA, and leverage that. And so telling packers, well, hey, if you don't get over this many head traded in any given week, we're not going to release publicly these LMR numbers, which, if you realize how formulas work, not just on the cattle side, but also on the beef side, that would cause some major disruption for their businesses, and essentially would be a stick to try and get them to get to certain levels. The other thing that is an option in terms of regulatory measures, the USDA actually has the ability to give monetary fines to packers if they don't meet the certain practices they're supposed to do to report prices through LMR. And so that would be another option that they could try and utilize to increase negotiated trade. once again, if you guys got any questions, just go ahead and either use the comment box or raise your hand, and Galen will kind of monitor that and let me know. So going a little more in depth then on the negotiated grid topic. As I mentioned, Jordan Levy has kind of put this idea together and has been pushing this. And essentially what it says is that when you use the live cattle contract through the CME to hedge your cattle, there is a grid underneath that you can deliver on at the settlement of the contract. And so if cattle feeders and packers and other people in the market are utilizing this hedge tool every day, well, can't we use the same specs that are on that grid and use that in every day in the negotiated market, and have packers allow cattle feeders to sell cattle on that grid? And essentially all it does is it takes the exact same specs that we use on that and applies it to the cash negotiated market for setting your base price. The way that they go about getting the premiums and discounts for that grid is that there actually is a USDA report that takes the average for all those. I think it's the LMCT 169 is what it's quoted there as. And so if you go ahead and decide to trade cattle on this negotiated grid, those would be the premiums and discounts that you would utilize. The other market-based option that I talked about, the market maker program, this gives you guys a little bit more of an idea of how that would work. When I was chair of NCBA's Live Cattle Marketing Committee, we went ahead and we created a subcommittee to look into this idea. And these were some of the options they put together just to give people an idea of how could this work and how would it be utilized. And so what we looked at is if you did $3 per head of cattle that are sold on a formula, how would that look, splitting that up and paying that to negotiated sellers. And what we did was we also looked at it on a region by region basis. And what you'll find out is, for instance, in areas like Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, that region does not have very much negotiated trade. And so there'll be a much larger pool of money, of funds, to pay negotiated cash people there. I'll go ahead and move to this next slide. This actually kind of breaks out how much you get paid per head at current volume levels the last 3 years if we do $3 per head. And so looking at Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, like I mentioned, that's a much higher amount than, say, what someone in Nebraska would get paid for negotiated. Well, that doesn't seem fair. But what you realize is that since the premium that they get paid in Texas to trade formula is that much higher, they need to get paid more in order to be incentivized to trade and negotiate market and give up that premium. Adversely, if you look at Nebraska and Iowa, since the premium to trade on formula is that much less, it costs less to get someone incentivized to trade negotiated in those areas. And so by breaking it by region, it's more efficiently applying those funds to people to try and get them trade negotiated. The one idea that we also thought of is, not the cattle feeder necessarily would not have to pay this. You could have it split between the cattle feeder and the packer. So the packer, for every animal that he buys on the formula, he'd have to pay $1.50, and he could split it with the cattle feeder. Maybe the packer pays all $3 and the cattle feeder doesn't pay any if he trades his cattle formula. There's a couple different ways of doing that. The other thing what's interesting about this is the only reason you could actually consider an idea like this is because of USDA, NPR, and LMR. Since they categorize and know exactly what bucket those cattle go into when they're traded, they're the ones that are able to define, should you get paid or should you not? Should you be paying into it or should you be getting paid out of it? And so if we actually went about and did this idea, the most efficient way of getting payment would probably be getting a voucher if you trade negotiated, and then you would turn that voucher in to whatever third party might be to get your payment in return. And the other interesting thing about this concept is it makes you really think through, where is the value of price discovery? And so since, the vast majority of weighted averages that are used for formulas are based off of one of the 5 area regions, so either Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, or the Iowa, Minnesota region, it makes you realize that negotiated trade that happens, say, in California, or negotiated trade that happens in, say, Ohio or Pennsylvania, it's not that it doesn't matter, but when it comes to the overall price discovery of the market, it doesn't matter very much. And thus, there really isn't much of a reason to help incentivize that financially because it doesn't contribute to the main price discovery of the market. Gail, and that is all I've got for these guys. I would open up for any questions or any thoughts, either on the legislative proposals on the mandate or on some of the market-based stuff, or even talk a little bit more through some of the regulatory measures that could be taken to help increase negotiated trade.
Questions for Steve? There's none in the chat box right now.
So Steve, how is the Fisher bill that was just introduced different than the one she introduced last year?
Good question. I haven't read completely into the bill, but I do know that there were some small changes that they made in terms of how they were looking at those minimum price levels. And so I know that they set a 3-year rolling average on them, but they set, I think, 2017 as the bottom level. And so the level could never go below the 2017 3-year rolling average level. I know that was one amendment that they made on it. There's also a few pieces in that bill that ask for additions to MPR. One is a kind of formula contract library that publishes any formula that's being used in the country. You can go on a website and see from an anonymous standpoint what those are. I think that was in her bill last time, but that's also in there. Another one is looking at a 14-day packer inventory, scheduled inventory. That's a report that they have on the hog side that they would ask for to also be done on the cattle side. That one was in her bill last year. It's in there again this year. Just some of the specs in terms of how that minimum robust price discovery level will be set was kind of the biggest differences. Was there anything else in there, Elliot, that you saw that was different from the last time she introduced it?
No, I was just curious. I didn't see that she introduced it, so I was wondering.
Yeah. So that was just introduced yesterday afternoon. So there hasn't been a ton of discussion around it yet, but I'm sure that give it a couple of weeks and there'll be plenty of people giving feedback on it.
Any other questions? All right, I'll stop the recording. Hold on.